The boar's tracks ended at the fountain. Kaelindra noticed this before anyone else in the morning crowd, before the two city watchmen who were busy interviewing the fishmonger whose stall had been overturned in the night, before the handful of early risers who had gathered at a careful distance to observe the wreckage of what had, until approximately 3 hours ago, been a perfectly functional corner of Velamore's eastern market. The tracks came from the alley between the Chandlers and the cooperage, deep and splayed in the cobblestone grime, the kind of impressions left by something that weighed considerably more than any boar had a right to weigh. They crossed the market square in a diagonal line of destruction. Overturned cart, shattered crate, a vendor's awning pole snapped at the base, and stopped, without transition, at the edge of the fountain's stone lip. No tracks leaving. The fountain basin was shallow and decorative and contained no boar. Kaelindra Voss filed this detail in the part of her mind that did not stop working on a problem because the immediate scene required attention elsewhere, and turned back to the stall she was ostensibly browsing, a spice merchant 2 rows back from the damage, and studied her husband from across the square. Farival was standing near the watchman, which was exactly where she had told him not to be. He was not interfering. He was, in the particular way he had of being present without appearing significant, simply nearby, tall, pale-haired, dressed in the muted grays of a scholar rather than the silks an Aelindran high elf of his lineage might have chosen, his hands in his pockets, his attention apparently on the overturned cart. The watchmen were not looking at him. No one was looking at him. Farival Voss, when he chose not to be noticed, achieved the quality of a well-placed chair, present, functional, beneath active observation. She knew he was reading the tracks.
She bought a small quantity of saffron she didn't need and walked home. Valleymore was a city of 40,000 built on the eastern edge of the Aldenmere forest, close enough to the tree line that the city's oldest neighborhood smelled of pine and damp earth on rainy mornings, far enough that its residents could pretend, most of the time, that the forest was scenery rather than context. It was a prosperous, orderly city, the kind of place where the cobblestones were maintained and the watch patrolled reliably, and the festivals happened on schedule. And the problems that existed were the problems of prosperity, commerce disputes, tax disagreements, the occasional guild conflict that required mediation. In the 18 years that Farival and Kaelindra Voss had lived here, it had been a good city to be invisible in. The house on Greenvale Lane was 3 stories, older than most of its neighbors, with a walled garden that backed against a secondary alley, a feature Farival had specifically required when they were choosing properties, for reasons he had framed as a preference for privacy, and that Kaelindra had understood, without discussion, meant exit route. The ground floor was a modest apothecary that Kaelindra ran with the competent, unhurried efficiency she brought to most things. The upper floors were home. She arrived before him, as she usually did, and had tea made by the time he came in through the garden gate. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table and looked at his hands for a moment, a habit he had, she had noticed, when he was organizing something complicated. "Werebore," he said. "I assumed. Recent. 6 months at most. The control is poor. The tracks show indecision and backtracking, which means the transformation is still fighting the host." He poured his tea, holding the pot with the precise economy of someone who had learned to manage strength very carefully. He doesn't know what he's doing yet.
The deaths last month and the market tonight? I don't think he's choosing to attack. I think he's losing the argument with himself. The hunters arrived this morning, Caliander said. I saw them at the south gate when I went for saffron. 4 of them. Professional. The equipment is Guildmark. She paused. Silver-tipped crossbow bolts. 2 longbows with silver inlaid arrows. The senior one had a sword I recognized as Thornvale steel, silver edge. Farival was quiet. They're not looking for a werebore specifically, she said. They're looking for a lycanthrope. They won't know what kind until they find it. No. Which means if they find any evidence of... I know. He looked up. His eyes, in the kitchen's morning light, were the pale silver gray of high elf lineage, striking, distinctive, the kind of eyes that people remembered. Where is Lyris? Still asleep. She was up late reading. A pause. Farival. She had another episode last night. The quality of his stillness changed. Lyris Voss was 14 years old, long-limbed and sharp-eyed, with her father's coloring and her mother's relentlessness, and for the past 3 months she had been experiencing what Farival had taken to calling episodes in the careful, contained language he used for things that frightened him. heightened temperature, restlessness at the full moon, sensitivity to smells that no one else in the house detected. Last week she had bent a copper kettle handle without noticing she was doing it, and when Calliandra had pointed this out, Lyris had looked at the ruined handle with an expression of pure bewilderment. Born lycanthropes, those who inherited the condition rather than receiving it through a bite, did not manifest until early adolescence. This was established in every text on the subject that Theraval had spent 18 years quietly accumulating. He had been hoping, without quite admitting it, that Lyris had inherited her mother's entirely human, entirely unencumbered blood.
"How bad?" he asked. "She didn't transform, but she knew something was happening. She came to our room at midnight and said she felt wrong, and she didn't know what wrong meant, and—" Calindra stopped, pressed her lips together. "She was scared, Theraval, and I couldn't tell her why." He stood up, pushed his chair back, walked to the kitchen window, and looked into the garden. The small, disciplined garden with its wall and its exit route. The life they had constructed with such care. He had chosen Valamore precisely because it was large enough to be anonymous and prosperous enough not to need to look too hard at its residents. He had kept every secret for 18 years. He had been, by his own assessment, meticulous. He had not accounted for the possibility of a werebore with no self-control and 4 Guildmark hunters arriving in the same week that his daughter first felt the moon's pull. "I need to find him before they do," he said. "And if they find you first?" He turned around. His expression was the one she knew best. Not calm exactly, but resolved. The face of someone who had stopped arguing with the situation and started planning inside it. "Then I'll have to manage that problem as well," he said. From upstairs, they heard Lyris's door open and her footsteps on the stairs, and her voice, younger than her composure usually let it sound. "Is there tea? I had the strangest night." Theraval and Calindra looked at each other across the kitchen. "There's tea," Calindra called back. "Come down." He found the werebore's secondary trail that afternoon, in the form of a broken fence post on Aldgate Row and a smear of dark residue on a warehouse wall that smelled, to anyone with the relevant olfactory capability, of fear sweat and animal musk and the particular metallic undertone of a body fighting its own chemistry. Theraval stood at the warehouse wall for approximately 4 seconds, catalogued everything, and walked on.
He was dressed as a scholar today, which he was, or had been, or remained in the compartmentalized way that people who have multiple selves maintain their least dangerous one as their primary public identity. He had a genuine appointment at the Valamore Civic Library at the 2nd hour of afternoon, a long-standing arrangement involving access to the restricted cartographic collection that gave him legitimate reason to be in this part of the city. He had real work to do there. He did it because the discipline of maintaining ordinary life was the thing that kept ordinary life intact. While he reviewed historical surveys of the Aldenmere forest boundary, he thought about the werebore. The transformation pattern he had observed, erratic, destructive in short bursts, followed by long periods of apparent absence, suggested a man who had been infected sometime in the summer and had spent the following months in progressive, losing negotiation with the change. The deaths last month had been attributed to a large animal in the press reports. The Watch had initially suspected a bear before the track evidence redirected them. 3 deaths, 2 of them at night, in the district closest to the forest, the old Tanner's Quarter, low population density, the kind of district where a man could move at the edges of himself with witnesses. The 3rd death had been in the Market District, midday, 6 weeks ago. That one had been harder to explain away. Theraval had been born with the curse. He had never had to learn the change the way the bitten did, in pieces, in horror, fighting biology that had been installed in him without consent. He had grown up with it, raised by parents who were both born lycanthropes, in a community that practiced the careful disciplines of controlled transformation with the same seriousness that other communities practiced any inherited art.
His parents had died long ago. Elven lifespan and lycanthropic inheritance did not always produce the centuries of careful elderhood that high elven culture prized, and his parents had made choices in their long lives that accumulated cost. But they had given him the one thing that made his life manageable, the knowledge of what he was, and the skill to be something more than it. He had 3 disciplines for the change. The first was lunar timing, knowing exactly where in the cycle the pull was strongest and managing his obligations accordingly. The second was the specific sequence of mental and physiological preparations that preconditioned the body before the change, reducing the wild component. The third, and most important, was what his mother had called the anchor, a fixed point of identity,
something with enough emotional mass to hold the self in place when the animal pushed against it. For his mother, the anchor had been a song. For his father, a name he repeated. For Tharavel, it had been, for the first 30 years of his life, the discipline itself, the practice, the craft, the studious management of the thing he was. Then Kaelindra had come along, and the anchor had gotten considerably more specific. And then Lyris. He closed the cartographic survey he was not really reading and thought about his daughter's face when she had come downstairs that morning. The dark circles, the faint confusion, the way she'd held her teacup with careful deliberateness as if she wasn't sure quite how much strength to apply. She was 14. She was at the beginning of something that would take years to understand and control, in a city that was currently hosting 4 professional hunters looking for any lycanthrope they could find. The timing was, as Kaelindra had observed with characteristic brevity, spectacularly bad.
The hunters' base of operations was the Aldgate Inn, and their leader was a woman named Bryn Coulter, 50 years old, gray-streaked, carrying herself with the economical assurance of someone who had been doing dangerous work long enough that danger had stopped requiring an audience. Tharavel identified her on his second observation pass, seated in the inn's common room with maps spread across the table and her 3 subordinates arranged with the practiced informality of a team that functioned well. He observed through the window from the street at a distance that allowed him to read the general shape of the briefing without hearing specifics. They had a map of the deaths. The map was accurate. The geographic pattern pointed clearly at the Tanner's Quarter and the forest boundary, the same pattern Tharavel had identified 3 weeks ago. He noted with professional respect and personal unease that Bryn Coulter was a very good hunter. He also noted on the inn's announcement board as he passed the entrance a posted notice from the Valamore City Watch, a formal declaration that the Hunters Guild team had been contracted and authorized to operate within city limits, with Watch cooperation, pursuant to the investigation of unlawful bestial attacks and associated fatalities. The notice bore the city warden's seal. Official sanction. That changed the parameters considerably. He walked home through the back streets and arrived to find Lyris at the garden table with her mother, engaged in what appeared to be an herbology lesson, Kaelindra's standard approach to sensitive topics, conducting them under the cover of practical activity. He caught his wife's eye over their daughter's head. She gave him a small, steady nod. I started it, carefully. Tharavel sat down at the table.
Lyris looked at him with a specific, sharp assessment she had been conducting for the past 3 months. The look of someone who knows a question exists and is trying to find the angle of approach that will actually produce an answer. She was, he had always known, very much like him in this way. "You know what's happening to me," she said. "Not an accusation, an observation." "Yes," he said. "And you've been waiting to tell me." "I've been waiting until I was certain," he said, "and until I knew how to explain it in a way that was true and useful rather than just true and frightening." "I'm already frightened," she said. "The useful part would help." He took a breath. He told her. Not all of it, not the full scope of what it meant, not the political and social risk, not the hunters currently 3 streets away with silver-edged weapons. He told her the essential truth, that their family carried a condition that was old and manageable and required discipline and knowledge, and was not, despite every story she had ever heard, the end of the life she was building. He told her about the anchor. He told her that she was not losing herself, she was finding a part of herself that had always been there, and that finding it was better than being found by it. Lyris was quiet for a long time. "Does anyone else know?" she asked. "Your mother." "No one else?" "No." She processed this. "The hunters," she said, "they're not here for a bear." He studied his daughter. "No. They're here because something else is hurting people." She was working it through in real time, assembling the picture with the speed he recognized. "And they might find us while they're looking for it." "Yes. So we have 2 problems." "Yes." She nodded slowly, with the expression of someone who had just received information that explained a great deal and resolved nothing. "All right," she said. "What do we do?" He found the werebore on the 3rd night, which was also the night of the near full moon, which was not ideal timing, but was the moon's timeline, not his.
The trail he had been following, built from 3 days of quiet, systematic observation, cross-referenced with the pattern of disturbances reported to the watch and the secondary markers that only certain kinds of attention could read, led him through the Tanner's Quarter and into the narrow belt of scrubland between the district's eastern edge and the forest proper. This was the territory the city's maps marked as undeveloped, and that in practice was a buffer zone of weeds and drainage ditches, and the occasional unauthorized structure built by people who couldn't afford the developed districts and couldn't bear the forest. He had prepared carefully. Sixth circle casting required focus and time. He had the focus and had spent the afternoon on the preparation, the quiet accumulation of intent that high elf training called the readying, which was not meditation exactly, but its functional cousin. He had specific spells in mind for specific contingencies. He had also, over 3 nights of careful groundwork, prepared something he'd had no occasion to use in years, the controlled partial shift. Born lycanthropes of sufficient discipline could hold intermediate states, not the full transformation, not the base elf, but a point between, where the enhanced senses and physical capacity of the wolf form could be accessed without the full commitment of the change. His parents had called it running the edge. It was difficult, requiring continuous attention, and it cost in ways that accumulated. He had not done it since Lyris was an infant, when a situation had required it, and afterward Kaelindra had sat across from him in this same kitchen and said nothing for a long moment before asking, with the directness he loved about her, "Are you all right?" He was running the edge now.
The scrubland at night, through partially shifted perception, was a completely different landscape. Sound layered on sound, the wind from the forest carrying 50 distinct signatures, the drainage ditches leaching their slow chemical histories into the soil, and beneath all of it, close and getting closer, the unmistakable compound signature of a lycanthrope in distress. He could smell the person inside the animal. It was a middle-aged man, probably, from the base note of it. Someone who smelled of wood smoke and leather and the specific quality of physical labor. The werebore transformation added a thick overlay of musk and adrenaline and something that was almost panic. He found him in a drainage ditch at the forest's edge. The transformation was partial, unstable. The werebore was caught somewhere in the change, half man and half animal, in the way that bitten lycanthropes sometimes were when stress triggered the shift without full progression. He was large, dark-bristled, his face distorted by the partial change into something between human and boar snout. He was also unmistakably conscious. There was someone behind the eyes, frightened and aware and in pain. Theravel crouched at the edge of the ditch, 10 feet away, and kept his voice low and steady. "I know you can hear me," he said. "I'm not here to hurt you. I need you to listen." The werebore made a sound that was half grunt, half groan, and pressed against the far bank of the ditch. "I know what's happening to you," Theravel said. "I know it started with a bite. I know you've been fighting it for months. I know you didn't choose the deaths." He paused. "My name is Theravel. I've been managing this condition since birth. I would like very much to help you do the same." A long silence, filled with the sound of labored breathing and the distant call of a nightbird in the forest. Then, "You're like me?" The voice was rough, distorted, but human. "In this way, yes."
"I killed people." The voice broke on the last word, the specific break of a man saying aloud what he had been carrying alone. "I didn't. I woke up and there was... I don't remember all of it, but I know what I did. Yes, I deserve..." "What you deserve," Theravel said, with the firmness of someone who had thought carefully about this question and arrived at a position, "is the help you needed months ago, before this progressed. We can discuss dessert later. Right now, I need you to focus on my voice and do exactly what I tell you." He walked the man through the process of reversing a partial shift. The breathing sequence, the mental anchoring, the deliberate relaxation of muscles that had locked in transformation posture. It took 40 minutes. Theravel was patient. He had done this before, for himself, in the early years before the discipline was fully established, and he had no impatience for the time it required.
The man who emerged from the ditch was broad-shouldered, mid-40s, with the calloused hands of a craftsman and the hollow-eyed look of someone who had not slept properly in months. His name, he said, was Don Ferret, a tanner, as it happened, from the tanner's quarter, which was a fact that Therivel absorbed without comment. He had been bitten in the forest 7 months ago, trying to retrieve a lost goat, and had told no one. "The hunters," Don said. "They're very close to finding you," Therivel confirmed, "which is why we need to move quickly." He had a plan. It was not, strictly speaking, a good plan. It had too many variables and required too much from someone who had just held a partial shift for the first time in months. But it was the best plan available, and it addressed all 3 problems simultaneously. Then the hunters found them. It was Bryn Coulter herself at the lead, crossbow raised, 2 subordinates flanking her.
She had followed Therivel's trail from the tanner's quarter, which meant she had been watching him, which meant she had noticed him, which meant the invisible chair had been less invisible than he had believed. "Step away from the lycanthrope," she said, calm, professional, giving the instruction as though it were inevitable. "He's not dangerous at this moment," Therivel said, standing slowly. "They're all dangerous." She was watching him with the assessment of someone who has spent 30 years looking at people through a professional lens and is currently updating a categorization. You knew where to find him. You tracked him here in the dark. You're not Watch, and you're not Guild. A pause. "Who are you?" "A concerned resident," Therivel said, "who would like to propose an alternative to what you're planning." Bryn Coulter looked at the half-transformed man behind him, at the elf in front of her, at the scrubland and the forest and the near full moon overhead. She did not lower the crossbow. "Talk fast," she said. He had prepared for this contingency with the thoroughness he applied to all the contingencies that could unravel everything. The proposal was this: Don Ferret was not a predator. He was a victim of infection who had failed to receive intervention and had been managing a crisis alone with no resources and no knowledge. The deaths, while real and irreversible, were not the actions of a willing killer. The city of Valemore had a physician, the same one who had been quietly documenting unusual cases, who had experience with lycanthropic infection management. With proper treatment, proper training, and proper oversight, Don Ferret could be a contributing member of the city, rather than a body in a drainage ditch. Bryn Coulter listened to all of this with the expression of someone who had heard a great many things over 30 years and was currently deciding which category this fell into. "You're asking me to not complete a contract," she said. "I'm asking you to consider whether the contract's intent, stopping the deaths, can be achieved through a method that doesn't require a killing. The guild contract specifies elimination. The city warden's authorization specifies resolution of the threat. Those are different documents." He had checked. He had specifically checked. "The threat is resolved if it stops. The contract requires you to use your professional judgment about method." Bryn Coulter lowered the crossbow 2 inches. Not all the way, 2 inches. "You know a great deal about how lycanthropes work," she said. "For a scholar. I read widely." A silence in the scrubland, the near full moon overhead, indifferent to the negotiations beneath it. "If there is another death," Bryn Coulter said, "we finish the original contract. No questions, no proposals. Understood?" "Understood." She raised the crossbow back to neutral carry and looked at him for a moment longer, the assessment still running, still updating, still arriving at a conclusion she did not voice. Then she turned and walked back toward the city. Her 2 subordinates followed. The third, the youngest, who had been watching the exchange with the expression of someone mentally filing it for future reference, gave Therivel a single unreadable look before following the others. Don Ferret sat on the ditch bank and pressed his face into his hands. "What just happened?" he said. "You got a second chance," Therivel said. "I would suggest treating it accordingly." The full moon rose at the 8th hour of evening, 3 days later. Therivel was in the garden.
The wall was chest-high, and the garden was dark, and the city beyond it went about its evening business with complete indifference. And he sat in the center of the space, and breathed the prepared breathing, and held the anchor with both hands, metaphorically speaking. Kylindra's face, Laris's voice on the stairs 3 mornings ago, the specific and irreplaceable weight of the life he had built, and let the pull do what it always did, which was to pull, and held the position, which was what you did.
He had done this for over a century, since the age when the lunar sensitivity first asserted itself in high elves who carried the condition. And it had not gotten easier exactly, but it had gotten known, which was its own kind of easier. He knew its shape. He knew where it pushed, and how hard, and what it wanted from him. He knew that what it wanted was not bad precisely, just animal, just old, just the part of him that predated the part that chose and planned and worried. The wolf was not an enemy. It was a different kind of self that required a different kind of management. His daughter was inside, upstairs, working through her own version of the same negotiation for only the second or third time. Kylindra was with her. He had spent 3 evenings giving Laris what his parents had given him, the framework, the language, the practices that made the condition navigable. Laris had received all of it with the focused, precise attention she brought to things she had decided were important, which was gratifying, and with a series of questions he hadn't been able to fully answer, which was also familiar. The questions he couldn't answer were mostly about the future. What does this mean for how long I live? For whether I can have a family? For what I become? He had told her the truth, which was that the answers were individual and unpredictable, and that the only people who had ever lived his specific life were him.
He told her the thing his mother had told him, which was that the curse was not the whole of her, and that every person she admired who had ever faced something immovable had found the same truth. You did not remove the stone from the path. You learned the path. She had been quiet for a long time after that. Then she had said, "Was that supposed to be comforting?" "Partially. It was about 40% comforting. That's approximately what I got from it at your age. It improves." Through the garden door, he heard her voice, steady, the breathing pattern he had taught her, and Kylindra's quieter response, and then a longer silence, and then his daughter's voice again, a little stronger. He held his anchor and let the moon do its work. Don Ferret had his first controlled session with the city physician, a woman named Haleth Wren, who had, it turned out, spent 12 years in a port city with a documented lycanthropic community, and had more practical knowledge of the condition's management than anyone else in Valemor on the morning of the 4th day. Tharivel had arranged the introduction through Kylindra, who had framed it as a referral for a patient with complex constitution, a description that was technically accurate. Physician Wren had taken one look at Don Ferret, taken one look at Tharivel accompanying him, and said with the clipped precision of someone who did not have time for circumlocution, "I've suspected this city had a quiet community for years. I appreciate finally having confirmation." She had then turned to Don with complete professional attention, and that had been that. The hunters departed on the 5th day. Tharivel observed their departure from the Greenvale Lane corner, watching the 4 of them load their equipment onto a contracted cart at the Aldgate Inn. Bryn Coulter was the last to load.
Before she climbed onto the cart, she turned, with the deliberateness of someone who knows they are being observed, and looked directly at the corner where Tharivel stood. She did not say anything. She gave him a single, measured nod, the nod of a professional acknowledging a resolution she had evaluated and, on balance, accepted, and climbed onto the cart. The cart moved through the south gate and into the road south. Tharivel watched it go. He thought about the young hunter, the one who had given him the unreadable look in the scrubland. He had caught, in the brief and unguarded moment before the look was composed back into neutrality, something that he had recognized. The specific quality of attention that a person developed when they were looking at a problem they had been told had a standard solution, and were beginning to suspect that the standard solution was not the only one. He made a mental note of the face. In his experience, people who looked at problems that way were either very useful or very dangerous, and the determining factor was usually which direction life pushed them next. The estate on Greenvale Lane settled back into its ordinary rhythms, with the particular resilience of a household that had survived difficult things by being very practiced at ordinary things. Kaliandra ran the apothecary. Tharivel read in the library on the 3rd floor, which had the best light in the house, and maintained his arrangements with the Civic Archive, and had twice-weekly sessions with Lyris that were nominally herbology and were actually the ongoing project of teaching his daughter the discipline that had held his life together for over a century. Lyris was, he was discovering, a remarkably quick study, not just in the practical sense, the breathing, the anchoring, the physical management, but in the deeper sense of understanding what the condition required philosophically.
She graspò
faster than he had, that the wolf was not a separate self to be imprisoned, but a different mode of the same self, and that the discipline was not suppression, but translation. She had asked him in their third session whether he had ever not held the anchor, whether the wolf had ever been fully loose, and he had answered honestly, twice, both in his first century, both before Kaelindra. He had not elaborated. She had not pushed, because she was 14, and there are things you ask at 20 that you can't quite ask at 14. And she had filed the answer in the way she filed everything, completely without comment, for later. One evening, 2 weeks after the hunter's departure, she came downstairs and sat across from him at the kitchen table, with the expression of someone who has been working up to a question. "You could have just let them find him," she said, "Don. The hunters would have dealt with it, and no one would have known anything about us." "Yes? Why didn't you?" He thought about how to answer this, the real answer, not the tactical one. "Because he was a man who needed help," he said. "Because the thing that was happening to him could have been managed with knowledge he never received. Because allowing him to die for a lack of information that I had," he paused. "There is a kind of safety that only works if you accept a cost to others for it. I have never been comfortable paying that." Lyris looked at him for a long moment. "Also," he said, "because if anyone in this city was ever in the position Don Ferret was in, I would want someone to do the same for them." He held her gaze, for obvious reasons. She nodded slowly. She understood. She was, as he had said, a quick study. "All right," she said. She looked down at the table, and then up again, and she was smiling. A small, somewhat complicated smile that was very much her own, and that had no direct parent in either his face or Kaelindra's, which was the best kind of smile.
40% comforting, again! Still improving, he said. He went out that night after the house was quiet, not from the garden gate, from the front door, because the night was calm and the city was asleep, and there was no one to observe a tall, pale-haired elf walking through the empty streets at the second hour past midnight. He walked to the tanner's quarter and stood at the edge of the scrubland and looked at the forest. The moon was 3/4 now, waning. He felt its diminishing pull with the familiar, bone-deep awareness of someone who had been navigating by it for over 100 years. He thought about Don Ferret, who had his second session with physician Wren tomorrow, and who had, according to Caliandra's last report from Wren, managed his first fully controlled partial shift 3 days ago. Confused, exhausted, triumphant in the specific way of someone who has done something they were not certain they could do. He thought about Lyris, asleep in her room, who had held her anchor through the last full moon without the shift breaking through, and who had come downstairs the morning after with dark circles and a slightly stunned expression, and said, with the combination of dignity and transparency he loved in her, "I think I did it. I'm not completely sure, but I think I did." He thought about Bryn Coulter and the young hunter with the unreadable face, and the fact that the world contained people who spent their lives learning to solve problems like him, and that some of them might eventually learn to ask whether the problem needed solving the way they'd been taught. He thought about the century he had lived before this city, and the century he might live after it, and the shape of a life built on anchoring, on the deliberate daily choice of what to hold and what to let go.
The forest breathed at the edge of the scrubland, the pine and the dark earth and the old wordless patience of things that had been there before cities existed and would be there after. It was not a threatening patience, it was just a fact, the kind of fact that became comfortable once you stopped trying to resolve it. Theravel stood at the city's edge for a while, in the company of the moon and the trees, and felt the pull and held the anchor, and was, by every reasonable measure, exactly where he had chosen to be. He walked home. The light in the kitchen window was on. Kaelindra, who never slept well when he was out, was awake and would have tea made. Lyris was almost certainly also awake, on the upper stair landing with a book and the plausible deniability of someone who had fallen asleep reading. He pushed open the gate. He walked through the garden. He went inside. 3 years later, physician Haleth Wren submitted a paper to the Aldenmere Medical Consortium titled Observation Notes on Congenital and Infectious Lycanthropy, Management Protocols and Community Outcomes, based on 5 years of quiet practice in Valamore. The paper documented, with the careful anonymity of good medical writing, 11 cases across the city, 3 congenital, 8 infectious, all currently stable, all integrated into ordinary civic life, all managed through the combination of practical training, community support, and the specific psychological framework the paper described as anchored identity practice. The paper cited no individual names. It cited a body of techniques that had been shared, informally, through a network of people who had needed them. The paper was rejected by the consortium on the grounds that it lacked adequate experimental controls and relied on a case sample of insufficient size. Halath Wren resubmitted it to 3 smaller regional medical societies, 2 of which accepted it.
She recebeu, over the following year, 14 letters from physicians in other cities describing patients they had not known how to help. She answered every letter. On Greenvale Lane, Larry's voice turned 17 and announced, with the specific tone of someone who has been planning something for long enough that the plan has become certainty, that she intended to study at the Aldenmere Academy of Natural Philosophy and that she had already drafted the application. She showed it to her parents at the kitchen table. Her father read it twice, her mother read it once, and said, "The third paragraph is stronger than the second. Restructure." Lyris restructured. The application was successful. She left for Aldenmere in the autumn with a packed trunk and a list of contacts from Physician Wren and the carved bone figure her father had placed at her door on the morning of her departure. His mother's, the seated figure with the boar's head, ancient and angular, and passed now to a third generation for whom it meant something new. She looked at it for a long moment before she packed it carefully in the center of her trunk, surrounded by everything soft she owned. In Valemur, the Greenvale Lane apothecary kept its hours, and the kitchen lights stayed on late, and the garden gate opened and closed as it always had, quietly, without announcement, the hinge oiled and maintained with the care of something that needed to work reliably. The moon rose and fell. The forest breathed at the city's edge. Somewhere in the Aldenmere Academy's first-year cohort, a pale-haired young woman sat in the natural philosophy lecture hall and looked at the world's architecture with her father's eyes. Patient, systematic, and not inclined to walk past an interesting question just because the practical thing was waiting. The anchor held. It always held.